Hunting with the Bow and Arrow by Saxton Pope. Read by Bambery. Dedicated to Robin Hood, a spirit that at some time dwells in the heart of every youth.
Chapter 14. Grizzly Bears. The very idea of shooting grizzly bears with the bow and arrow strikes most people as so absurd that they laugh at the mention of it. The mental picture of the puny little archery implements of their childhood, opposed to that of the largest and most fearsome beast of the Western world, produces merriment and incredulity. Because it seems so impossible, I presume, this added to our desire to accomplish it. Ever since we began hunting with the bow, we had talked of shooting grizzlies. We thought of an Alaskan trip as a remote, attainable adventure, and planned murderous arrows of various ingenious spring devices to increase their cutting qualities. We estimated the power of formidable bows necessary to pierce the hides of these monsters. In fact, it was the acme of our hunting desires. We read the biography of John Captain Adams and his adventures with the California grizzlies, and Roosevelt's admirable description of these animals. They filled out our dreams with detail, and after killing black bears, we needed only the opportunity to make our wish become an exploit. The opportunity to do this arrived unexpectedly, as many opportunities seem to, when the want and the preparedness coincide. The California Academy of Sciences has in its museum in Golden Gate Park, San Francisco, a collection of very fine animal habitat groups, among which are deer, antelope, mountain sheep, cougars, and brown bear. While an elk group was being installed, it happened that taxidermist Mr. Paul Fair said to me that the next and final setting would be one of grizzly bears. In surprise, I asked him if it were not a fact that the California grizzly was extinct. He said it was true, but the silver-tipped bear of Wyoming was a grizzly, and its range extended westward to the Sierra Nevada mountains, so it could properly be classified as a Pacific Coast variety. He cited Professor Merriman's monograph on the classification of grizzlies to prove his statements. He also informed me that permit might be obtained from Washington to secure these specimens in Yellowstone National Park. Immediately, I perceived an opportunity and interviewed Dr. Barton Everman, curator of the museum, concerning the feasibility of offering our services in taking these bears at no expense to the Academy. Incidentally, we proposed to shoot them with the bow and arrow, and thereby answer a moot question in anthropology. The proposition appealed to him, and he wrote to Washington for a permit to secure specimens in this national park, stating that the bow and arrow would be used. I insisted upon this latter stipulation, so that there should be no misunderstanding if, in the future, any objection was raised to this method of hunting. In a very short time, permit was given to the Academy, and we started our preparations for the expedition. This was late in the fall of 1919, and bear were at their best in the spring, just after hibernation, so we had ample time. It was planned that Mr. Compton, Mr. Young, and I should be the hunters, and such other assistance would be obtained as seemed necessary. We began reviewing our experience and formulation the principles of the campaign. Our weapons we now considered adequate in light of our contact with black bears. We had found that our bows were as strong as we could handle, and ample to drive a good arrow through a horse, a fact which we had demonstrated upon the carcasses of recently dead animals. But we decided to add to the length of our arrowheads. We used tempered instead of soft steel as heretofore. We took particular pains to have them perfect in every detail. Then we undertook the study of the anatomy of bears and the location and size of their vital organs. In the work of William Wright on the grizzly, we found valuable data concerning the habits and nature of these animals. In spite of the reputation of this bear for ferocity and tenacity of life, we felt that, after all, he was only made of flesh and blood, and our arrows were capable of solving the problem. We also began preparing ourselves for the contest. Although habitually in good physical condition, we undertook special training for the big event. By running, the use of dumbbells, and other gymnastic practices, we strengthened our muscles and increased our endurance. Our field shooting was also directed towards rapid delivery and quick judgment of distances on level, uphill, and falling ground. In fact, we planned to leave no factor for success untried. My brother, J.D. Pope of Detroit, being a hunter of big game with the gun, was invited to join the party, and his advice was asked concerning a reliable guide. He gladly consented to come with us and share the expenses. At the same time, he suggested Ned Frost of Cody, Wyoming, as the most experienced hunter of grizzly bears in America. About this time, one of my professional friends visited the Smithsonian Institute at Washington, where he met a member of the staff who inquired if he knew Dr. Pope of San Francisco, a man that was contemplating shooting grizzlies with the bow and arrow. The doctor replied that he did, whereat the sage laughed and said that the feat was impossible, most dangerous, and foolhardy. It could not be done. We fully appreciated the danger involved. Therein lay some of the zest. But we also knew that even if we should succeed in killing them in Yellowstone Park, the glory would be sullied by the popular belief that all park bears are hotel pets, live upon garbage, and that it was a cruel shame to torment them with arrows. So in my early correspondence with Frost, I assured him that we did not want to shoot any tame bears, and that we would not consider the trip at all if this were necessary. He assured us that this was not necessary, and reminded us that Yellowstone Park was 50 miles wide and 60 miles long, and that some of the highest portions of the Rocky Mountains lay in it. The animals in this preserve, he said, were far from tame, and the bears were divided into two distinct groups, one mostly composed of black and brown, with a few inferior specimens of grizzlies that frequent the dumps back of the camps and hotels, and another group of bears that never come near civilization, but lived entirely up in the rugged mountains and were as dangerous and wary as those in Alaska or any other wild country. These bears wandered outside the park and furnished hunting material throughout the neighboring state. He promised to put us in communication with grizzlies that were as unspoiled and unafraid as those first seen by Lewis and Clark in their early explorations. After explaining the purpose of our trip and the use of the bow, Ned Frost agreed that it was a real sporting proposition and took up the plan with enthusiasm. I sent him a sample arrow we used in hunting, and his letter in reply I take the liberty of printing. It is typical of the frontier spirit, and comes not only from the foremost grizzly hunter of all times, but discloses the man's bigness of heart. My dear doctor, your letter of the 18th was received a day or so ago, and last night I received good medicine, a hunting arrow, on the evening train, and I feel better away down deep about this hunt after a good examination of this little grizzly tickler than I have at any time before. I have, by mistake, let it simmer out in a quiet way that I was going to see what a grizzly would really do if he had a few sticks stuck in his innards, and my friends have been giving the missus and me a regular line of farewell parties. Really, I think it's been a splendid paying thing to do. Pork chops are high, you know, and I really feel I'm off to the good about $9.06 worth of bacon and flour right now on this deal. Maybe I'll be in debt to you before green grass if I don't look out. Well, anyway, here's hoping we all live through it and have a dandy time. Don't worry about coming to blows with the bear. I have noticed from long experience that it is not the times that you think a bear is going to give you trouble that it happens, but when least expected. I have trailed wounded grizzlies time and time again, and was more or less worried all the while, but never had one turned on me yet. Then, too, I have had about 3 experiences with them that made my hair stand straight up, and when it finally settled, it had more frost in it than ever before. And let me add right here that one of the worst places I ever got into was when I had 16 of the best bear dogs that ever were gotten together, I believe, after an old she-grizzly, and I was like you, thought that they would hold the bear's attention. But don't let any notion like this get you into trouble. Now, I'm not running down dogs as a means of getting bear. I love them and would now have a good pack if it was possible to run them in the game fields of this state. But you don't want to think that they can handle a grizzly like they do a black bear. In fact, I would place no value on them whatsoever as a safeguard in case a grizzly got on the pack. And I'm speaking from experience, mind you. No, a good little shepherd would do more than a dozen regular bear dogs, but there's only about one little shepherd like I speak of in a lifetime. If you can use the bow from horseback, here is a safe proposition, and I believe a practical one too. But I don't feel there is really so much danger in the game after all, as it's only once in a great while that any bear will go up against the human animal, and then is most likely to be when you're not expecting it at all. Don't worry about it. What I'm thinking about most is getting the opportunity to get the first arrow into some good, big, worthy old boy that will be a credit to the expedition. There are lots of grizzlies in the park, all right, and some of them are not very wild. But if you get out away from the hotels a few miles, they are not going to come up and present their broadsides to you at 30 yards. So as I say, I am thinking mostly about the chances of getting the opportunities. I don't know, of course, just how close you can place your arrows at 30 yards. And it is getting the first hole into them that I am most interested in now. I feel that we ought to get some good chances, as I have seen so many bear in the park, but, of course, have never hunted them, and don't know just how keen they will be when it comes right down to getting their hides. There are some scattered all over the park that will rob a camp at night, and some of them will even put up a fight for it, but most of them will beat it as soon as one gets after them. It would be impossible, I believe, to keep dogs still while watching a bait, as they would get the scent of any approaching bear, and then you would not be able to keep them quiet, and they would most likely scare the bear out of the country. I can rustle a few dogs to take along if you want them, and pretty good dogs too, but I am not strong for them myself, only in this way, to put them on the trail of a bear and take a good horse apiece, so that we could get up to the chase and have a chance to land on him. This might be a good thing to try if all others failed. I know how you feel about killing clean with the bow and not having any shooting, and I can assure you that I will let them get as close as you want them, and not feel any concern about their getting the best of anybody, and you would have a chance to use the bow well in this case. But I am more prone to think they will beat it off with a lot of your perfectly good arrows than anything else. Yours truly, Ned Frost. It was apparent from the first that dogs were of little use in taking Grizzly. It would be necessary to shoot from blinds set conveniently near bait. Frost assured us that bears of this variety, when just out of hibernation and lean, would run out of the country if chased by a pack of dogs, and incidentally kill all that they could catch. In the fall of the year, when the bears are fat, they refuse to run, but wade through the pack, which is unable to keep him from attacking the hunter. As an example of this, he related an instance where he started a grizzly with 8 or 10 Russian bear hounds and chased the beast about 30 miles. As he followed on horseback, he found one after another of his dogs torn to pieces, disemboweled and dismembered. At last he came upon the bear at bay in deep snow, against a high cliff. Only 2 of his hounds left, and one of these had a broken leg. Mad with vengeance, Frost shot the grizzly. It charged him at 40 yards. In quick succession he fired 5 bullets in the oncoming bear, seemingly with no effect. Up to his waist in the snow, he was unable to avoid its rush. It came on hard and fell on his chest, with the faithful hound hanging on it in a desperate effort to save his master. This is one of the 3 or 4 maulings that Ned has received in his hunting experiences, which, he says, has added frost to my golden locks. The dog became a cherished pet in the family for many years. Frost killed his first bear when he was 14 years of age, and has added nearly 500 to this number since that time. It is a characteristic of the grizzly that he will charge upon the slightest provocation, and that nothing will turn him aside from his purpose. Later we found this is particularly true where the female with cubs is concerned. Instances of this are too well known to recount, but one coming under our own experience was related to me by Tom Murphy, the bear hunter of California. In early days in Humboldt County there lived an old settler named Pete Bluford, who was a squaw man. He shot a female grizzly with cubs within a quarter mile of what are now the town limits of Bloxburg. The beast charged and struck him to the ground. At the same time she ripped open the man's abdomen. Bluford dropped under a fallen tree, where the bear repeatedly assaulted him, tearing at his body. By rolling back and forth, as the grizzly leaped over the log to reach him from the other side, he escaped further injury. Worried by the hunter's dog, she finally ceased her efforts and wandered off. The man was able to reach home in spite of a large open wound in his abdomen with protruding intestines. This was roughly sewed together by his friend, Beanie Powell. He recovered from the experience and lived many years with the Indians of that locality. As an example of Western humor, it is related that Benny Powell, when sewing up the wound with twine and a sack needle, found a large lump of fat protruding from the incision, of which he was unable to dispose. So he cut it off, tried out the grease in the frying pan, and used it to grease his boots. Old Buford became a character in the county. He was, in fact, what is colloquially known as an old poison oaker. This is an individual who sinks so low in the scale of civilization that he lives out in the backwoods or poison oak brush and becomes an animal in type. His hair grew to his shoulders, his beard was unkempt, his fingernails were as long as claws and filthy with dirt. Rags of unknown antiquity partially covered his limbs, vermin infested his body, and he stayed with the most degraded remnants of the Indians. One cold winter they found him dead in his dilapidated cabin. He lay on the dirt floor, his ragged coat over his face, his hands beneath his head, and 2 house cats lay frozen, one beneath each arm. These old pioneers were strange people and died strange deaths. In our plans to capture grizzlies, we took into consideration the proclivity of the beast to attack. We knew his speed was tremendous. He is able to catch a horse or a dog on the run. Therefore, it is useless for a man to try to run away from him. There is no such thing as being able to climb a tree if the animal is at close quarters. Adams has shown that it is a mistake to attempt it. One only stretches himself out, inviting evisceration in the effort. We decided, if cornered, to dodge or to lie flat and feign death, so we practiced dodging, our running being more for the purpose of gaining endurance and to follow the bear if necessary. Ishi, the Yana Indian, said that grizzlies were to be overcome with arrows, and if they charged, they were to be met with the spear and fire. So we constructed spears having well-tempered blades more than a foot in length, set upon heavy iron tubing, and riveted to strong ash handles 6 feet in length. Back of the blade we fashioned quick-lighting torches of cotton waste saturated with turpentine. These could be ignited by jerking a lanyard fastened to a spring faced with sandpaper. The spring rested on the ends of several matches. It was an ingenious and reliable device. The Esquimaux used a long spear in hunting the polar bear. It was 10 or 12 feet in length. After being shot with an arrow, if the bear charged, they rested the butt of the spear on the ground, lowered the point, and let the bear impale himself on it. When the time came to use our weapons, Ned Frost dissuaded us from the attempt. He said that once he owned a pet grizzly and kept it fast with a long chain in the backyard. This bear was so quick that it could lie in its kennel apparently asleep, and if a chicken passed within proper distance, with incredulous quickness she reached out a paw and seized the chicken without the slightest semblance of effort. And when at play, the boys tried to stick the bear with the pitchfork. She would parry the thrust and protect herself like a boxer. It was impossible to touch her. The fire, Frost thought, might serve at night, but in the daylight would lose its effect. So he insisted that he would carry a gun to be used in case of attack. On our part, we stipulated that he was to resort to it only to prevent disaster, and protested that such an exigency must be looked upon by us as a complete failure of our plans. We knew we could not stop the mad rush of a bear with our arrows, but we hoped to kill at least one by this means and compromise on the rest if necessary. Indians, besides employing the spear, poisoned arrows, and fire, also used protected positions or shot from horseback. We scorned to shoot from a tree, and were told that few horses could be ridden close enough or fast enough to get within bowshot of a grizzly. Inquiring among those qualified to know led to the estimate of the number of all bears in the park to be between 500 and 1,000. Considering that there are some 3,000 square miles of land, that there are nearly 60,000 elk, besides hundreds of bison, antelope, mountain sheep, and similar animals, this does not seem improbable. I am aware that recent statements are to the effect that there were only 40 grizzlies there. This is palpably an underestimate, and probably takes into account only those that frequent the dumps. Frost believes that there are several hundred grizzlies in the park, many of which range out into the adjacent country, so we felt no fear of decimating their ranks, and had every hope of seeing many. In fact, their number has so increased in recent years that they have become a menace and require killing off. During the past 5 years, 4 persons have either been mauled or killed by grizzlies in Yellowstone. One of these was a teamster by the name of Jack Walsh. He was sleeping under his wagon at Cold Springs when a large bear seized him by the arm, dragged him forth, and ripped open his abdomen. Walsh died of blood poison and peritonitis a few days later. Frost himself was attacked. He was conducting a party of tourists through the preserve and had just been explaining to them around the campfire that there was no danger of bears. He slept in the tent with a horse wrangler by the name of Photograph Jones. In the middle of the night, a huge grizzly entered his tent and stepped on the head of Jones, peeling the skin off his face by the rough pressure of his paw. The man waked with a yell, whereupon the bear clawed out his lower ribs. The cry roused Frost, who, having no firearms, hurled his pillow at the bear. With a roar, the grizzly leaped upon Ned, who dived into his sleeping bag. The animal grasped him by the thighs and dragged him from the tent out into the forest, sleeping bag and all. As he carried off his victim, he shook him from side to side as a dog shakes a rat. Frost felt the great teeth settle down on his thigh bones and expected momentarily to have them crushed in the powerful jaws. In a thicket of jack pines over 100 yards from camp, the bear shook him so violently that the muscles of the man's thighs tore out and he was hurled free from the bag. He landed half naked in the undergrowth several yards away. While the frenzied bear still worried the bedding, Frost dragged himself to a nearby pine and pulled himself up into its branches by the strength of his arms. The camp was in an uproar. Huge fire was kindled, tin pans were beaten, one of the helpers mounted a horse, and by circling around the bear succeeded in driving him away. After first aid measures were administered, Frost was successfully nursed back to health and usefulness by his wife. But since that time he has an inveterate hatred of grizzlies, hunting them with grim persistency. It is said that nearly 40 obnoxious grizzlies were shot by the park rangers after this episode, and Frost was given a permit to carry a weapon. We found later that he always went to sleep with a Colt automatic pistol strapped to his wrist. We planned to enter the park in 2 parties. One comprised of Frost, the cook, horse wrangler, my brother, and his friend, Judge Henry Hubert of Detroit, was to proceed from Cody and come with a pack train across Sullivan Pass. Our party consisted of Arthur Young and myself. Mr. Compton was unexpectedly prevented from joining us by sickness in his family. We were to journey by rail to Ashton. This was the nearest point to Yellowstone Station on the boundary of the reservation that could be reached by railroad in the winter. We arrived at this point near the last of May, 1920. The roads beyond were blocked with snow, but by good fortune we were taken in by one of the first work trains entering the region through the personal interest and courtesy of the superintendent of the Pocatello Division. We had shipped ahead of us a quantity of provisions and came outfitted only with sleeping bags, extra clothing, and our archery equipment. This later consisted of 2 bows apiece and carrying a case containing 144 broadheads, the finest assembly of bows and arrows since the Battle of Crecy. Young had one newly made bow weighing 85 pounds and his well-tried companion of many hunts, old Grizzly, weighing 75 pounds. He later found the heavier weapon too strong for him in the cold weather of the mountains, where a man's muscles stiffen and lose their power while the bow grows stronger. My own bows were 75 pounds apiece. Old Horrible, my favorite, a hard hitter and sweet to shoot, and Bear Slayer, the fine-grained, cooked-limb staff with which I helped to kill our first bear. Our arrows were the usual 3/8 birch shaft, carefully selected, straight and true. Their heads were tempered steel and sharp as daggers. We had, of course, a few blunts and eagle arrows in the lot. In the park we found snow deep on the ground, and the roads were but recently cleared with snowplows and Caterpillar tractors. We traveled by auto to Mammoth Hot Springs and paid our respects to Superintendent Albright, and ultimately settled in a vacant ranger's cabin near the canyon. Here we awaited the coming of the second party. Our entrance to the park was well known to the rangers, who were instructed to give us all the assistance possible. This cabin soon became a rendezvous for them, and our evenings were spent pleasantly with stories and fireside music. After several days, word was sent by telephone that Frost and his caravan were unable to cross Sullivan Pass because of 50 feet of snow in the defile, and that he had returned to Cody, where he would take an auto truck and come around to the northern entrance to the park through Gardner, Montana. At the expiration of 3 days, he drove up to our cabin in a flurry of snow. This was about the last day in May. Frost himself is one of the finest Western types, born and raised in the sagebrush country, a hunter of big game ever since he was large enough to hold a gun. He was in the prime of life, a man of infinite resource, courage, and fortitude. We admired him immensely. With him he had a full camp outfit, selected after years of experience and suited to any kind of weather. The party consisted of Art Cunningham, the cook, J.D. Pope, and Judge Henry Hubert. Art came equipped with a vast amount of campcraft and cookery wisdom. My brother came to see the fun, the judge to take pictures and add dignity to the occasion. All were seasoned woodsmen and hunters. We moved to more commodious quarters, a log cabin in the vicinity, made ourselves comfortable, and let the wind-driven snow pile deep drifts about our warm shelter while we planned a campaign against the grizzlies. So far we had met few bears, and these were of the tourist variety. They had stolen bacon from the elevated meat safe. and one we found in the woods sitting on his haunches calmly eating the contents of a box of soda crackers. These were hotel pets and were nothing more than of a passing interest to us. Contrary to the usual condition, no grizzlies were to be seen. The only animals in evidence were a few half-starved elk that had wintered in the park, marmots, and the Canadian jaybirds. We began our hunts on foot, exploring Hayden Valley, the Sour Creek region, Mount Washburn, and the headwaters of Cascade Creek. The ground was very wet in places and heavy with snow in the woods. It was necessary, therefore, to wear rubber packs, a type of shoe well suited to this sort of travel. Our party divided into two groups, usually my brother and the judge exploring in one direction, while Young and I kept close at the heels of Frost. We climbed all the high ridges and swept the country with our binocular glasses. From 8 to 14 hours a day we walked and combed the country for bear sign. Our original plan was to bring in several decrepit old horses with the pack train and sacrifice them for bait. But because of the failure of this part of our program, we are forced to find dead elk for this purpose. We came across a number of old carcasses, but no signs that bear had visited them recently. Our first encounter with Grizzly came on the 4th day. We were scouting over the country near Sulphur Mountain when Frost saw Grizzly a mile off, feeding in a little valley. The snow had melted there, and he was calmly digging roots in the soft ground. We signaled to our party, and all drew together as we advanced on our first bear, keeping out of sight as we did so. We planned to go rapidly down a little cut in the hills and intercept him as he came around the turn. Progressing at a rapid pace, Indian file, we 5 hunters went down the draw, when suddenly our bear, who had taken an unexpected cutoff, came walking up the ravine. At a sign from Ned, we dropped to our knees and awaited developments. The bear had not seen us, and the faint breeze blew from him to us. He was about 200 yards off. We were all in a direct line, Frost ahead, I next, Young behind me, and the others in the rear. Our bows were braced and arrows nocked. Slowly the bear came feeding towards us. He dug the roots of white violets. He sniffed. He meandered back and forth, wholly unconscious of our presence. We hardly breathed. He was not a good specimen, rather scrawny, long-nosed, male adolescent, but a real grizzly, and he would do as a starter. At last he came within 50 yards, stopped, pawed a patch of snow, and we still did not shoot. We could not without changing our position because we were all in one line, so we waited for his next move, hoping that he would advance laterally and possibly give us a good broadside exposure. But he came onward directly for us, and at 30 yards stopped to rut in the ground again. I thought, now we must shoot or he will walk over us. Just then he lifted his head and seemed to take an eyeful of Young's blue shirt. For 1 second he half reared and stared. I drew my bow, and as the arrow left the string, he bounded up the hill. The flying shaft just grazed his shoulder, parting the fur in its course. Quick as a bouncing rubber ball, he leaped over the ground, and as Young's belated arrow whizzed past him, he disappeared over the hill crest. We rose with a deep breath and shouted with laughter. Ned said that if it had not been for that blue shirt, the bear would have bumped into us. Well, we were glad we missed him, because after all, he was not the one we were looking for. It's a hard thing to pick grizzlies to order. You can't go up and inspect them ahead of time. This fiasco is just an encouragement to us, and we continued to rise by candlelight and hunt till dark. The weather turned warmer, and the snow began to melt. At the end of the first week, we saw 5 grizzlies way off in the distance at the head of Hayden Valley. They were 3 or 4 miles from us, and evening was approaching, so we postponed an attack on them. Next morning, bright and early, we were on the ground again, hoping to see them. Sure enough, there they were. Ned, Art, and I were together. My brother and the judge were off scouting on the other side of the ridge. It was about 8:30 in the morning. The bears, 4 in number this time, were feeding in the grassy marshland, about 3 miles up the valley. Ned's motto has always been, when you see 'em, go and get 'em. We decided to attack immediately. Down the river bank, through the draws, up into the timber we circled at a trot. It was hard going, but we were pressed for time. At last we came out on a wooded point 1/4 of a mile above the bears and rested. We knew they were about to finish their morning feeding and go up into the forest to lay up for the day, so we watched them in seclusion. We waxed our bowstrings and put the finishing touches on our arrowheads with a file. Slowly the bears mounted the foothills, heading for a large patch of snow, where Frost thought they would lie down to cool before entering the woods. It seems their winter coat makes them very susceptible to heat, and though the sun had come out pleasantly for us, it was too hot for them. There was an old female and 3 half-grown cubs in their 3rd year, all looking big enough for any museum group. At last they settled down and began to nuzzle the snow. The time had come for action. We proposed to slip down the little ravine at the edge of the timber, cross the stream, ascend the hill on the opposite side, and come up on our quarry over the crest. We should thus be within shooting distance. The wind was right for this maneuver, so we started at once. Now as I write, my muscles quiver, my heart thumps, and I flush with a strange feeling, thinking of that moment. Like a soldier before a battle, we waded into an uncharted experience. What does a man think as he's about to enter his first grizzly encounter? I remember well what passed through my head. Can we get there without alarming the brutes? How close will they be? Can we hit them? What will happen then? Ned Frost, Young, and I were to sneak up on 4 healthy grizzlies in the open and pit our nerve against their savage reaction. Ned had his rifle, but this was to be used only as a last resort, and that might easily fail at such short range. As we walked rapidly, stepping with utmost caution, I answered all the questions of my subconscious fears. Hit them? Why, we will soak them in the gizzard, wreck them, charge, let them come on, and may the best man win. Die? There was never a fairer, brighter, better day to die on. In fact, lead on. I felt absolutely gay. A little profanity or a little intellectual detachment at these times is of material help in the process of autosuggestion. As for Young, he was silent, and possibly thinking of Camp Flapjacks. Halfway up the hill on the opposite side of which lay our grizzlies, we stopped, braced our bows, took 3 arrows apiece from our quivers, and proceeded in a more stealthy approach. Young and I arranged ourselves on each side of Frost, abreast with him. Near the top, Ned took out a green silk handkerchief and floated it gently in the breeze to see if the wind had changed. If it had, we might find the bears coming over the top to meet us. Everything was perfect, so far. Now, stooping low, we crept to the very ridge itself, to a spot directly above which we believed the bears to be. Laying our hats on the grass and sticking our extra arrows in the ground before us, we rose up, bows half drawn, ready to shoot. There on the snow, not over 25 yards off, lay 4 grizzly bears, just like so many hearth rugs. Instantly I selected the farthest bear for my mark, and at a signal of the eye we drew our great bows to their utmost and loosed 2 deadly arrows. We struck. There was a roar. They rose, but instead of charging us, they rushed together and began such a fight as few men have seen. My bear, pinioned with an arrow in the shoulder, threw himself on his mother, biting her with savage fury. She in turn bit him in the bloody shoulder and snapped my arrow off short. Then all the cubs attacked her. The growls and bellowing were terrific. Quickly I knocked another arrow. The beasts were milling around, pawing, biting, mad with rage. I shot at my bear and missed him. I knocked again. The old she-bear, reared on her haunches, stood high above the circling bunch, cuffing and roaring, the blood running from her mouth and nostrils in frothy streams. Young's arrow was deep in her chest. I drove a feathered shaft below her foreleg. The confusion and bellowing increased. As I drew a 4th arrow from my quiver, I glanced up in time to see the old female's hair rise on the back of her neck. She steadied herself in her wild hurtling and directly at us with red glaring eyes. She saw us for the first time. Instinctively I knew she would charge, and she did. Quick as I thought, she bounded toward us. 2 great leaps and she was on us. A gun went off in my ear. The bear was literally knocked head over heels and fell backward somersault down the steep snowbank. At some 50 yards she checked her course, gathered herself, and attempted to charge again, but her right foreleg failed her. She rose on her haunches in an effort to advance, when like a flash 2 arrows flew at her and disappeared through her heaving sides. She faltered, wilted, and as we drew to shoot again, she sprawled out on the ground, a convulsed, quivering mass of fur and muscle. She was dead. The half-grown cubs had disappeared at the boom of the gun. We saw one making off at a gallop 300 yards away. The glittering snowbank before us was vacant. The air seemed strangely still. The silence was oppressive. Our nervous tension exploded in a wave of laughter and exclamations of wonderment. Frost declared he had never seen such a spectacle in all his life. 4 grizzly bears in deadly combat. The din of battle, the wild bellowing, and 2 bowmen shooting arrow after arrow into this jumble of struggling beasts. The snow was trampled and soaked with blood as though there had been an Indian massacre. We paced off the distance at which the charging female had been stopped. It was exactly 80 yards. A mighty handy shot. We went down to view the remains. Young had 3 arrows in the old boar, one deep in her neck, its point emerging back of the shoulder. He shot that as she came at us. His first arrow struck interior to her shoulder, entered her chest, cut her left lung from top to bottom. His third arrow pierced her thorax through and through, and lay on the ground beside her with only its feather in the wound. My first arrow cut below the diaphragm, penetrated the stomach and liver, severed the gall ducts and portal vein. My second arrow passed completely through her abdomen and lay on the ground several yards beyond her. It had cut the intestines in a dozen places and opened large branches of the mesenteric artery. The bullet from Frost's gun had entered the right shoulder, fractured the humerus, blown a hole an inch in diameter in the chest wall, opened up a jagged hole in the trachea, and dissipated its energy in the left lung. No wound of exit was found. The soft-nosed, copper jacket bullet apparently having gone to pieces after striking the bone. Anatomically speaking, it was an effective shot, knocked the bear down and crippled her, but was not an immediately fatal wound. We had killed her with arrows, but she did not know it. She undoubtedly would have been right on us in another second. The outcome of this hypothetical encounter I leave to those with vivid imaginations. We hereby express our gratitude to Ned Frost. Now one of us had to rush off and get the rest of the party. Judge Hulbert and my brother were in another valley in quest of bear, so Ned set off at a rapid tramp across the bogs, streams, and hills to find them. Within an hour they returned together to view the wreckage. Photographs were taken, the skinning and autopsy were performed. Then we looked round for the wounded cub. Frost trailed him by almost invisible blood stains and tracks, and found him less than a quarter of a mile away, huddled up as if asleep on the hillside, with my arrow nestled to his breast. The broken shaft with its blade deep in the thorax had completely severed the head of the humerus, cut 2 ribs, and killed him by hemorrhage from the pulmonary arteries. Half-grown as he was, he would have made an ugly antagonist for any man. His mother, a fine mature lady of the old school, showed by her teeth and other lineaments her age and respectability. In autumn she would have weighed 400 or 500 pounds. We weighed her in installments using our spring scales. She registered 305 pounds. She was in poor condition, and her pelt was not suitable for museum purposes, but these features could not be determined readily beforehand. The juvenile Ursus weighed 135 pounds. We measured them, gathered their bones for the museum, shouldered their hides, and turned back to camp. That night, Ned Frost said, "Boys, when you proposed shooting grizzly bears with the bow and arrow, I thought it a fine sporting proposition, but I had my doubts about its success. Now I know that you can shoot through and kill the biggest grizzly in Wyoming." Our instructions on leaving California were to secure a large male Ursus horribilis imperator, a good representative female, and 2 or 3 cubs. The female we had shot filled the requirements fairly well, but the 2-year-old cub was at a high school age and hardly cute enough to be admired. Moreover, no sooner had we sent the news of our first success to the museum than we were informed that this size cub was not wanted and that we must secure little ones. So we set out to get some of this year's vintage in small bears. Ordinarily, there is no difficulty in coming in contact with bears in Yellowstone. In fact, it is more common to try to keep some of the hotel variety from eating at the same table with you. But not a single bear, black, brown, or silver-tip, now called upon us. We traveled all over that beautiful park, from Mammoth Hot Springs to the lake. We hunted over every well-known bear district: Tower Falls, Specimen Ridge, Buffalo Corrals, Mount Washburn, Dunraven Pass under 20 feet of snow, Antelope Creek, Pelican Meadows, Cub Creek, Steamboat Point, and kept the rangers busy on the lookout for bear. From 8 to 15 hours a day we hunted. We walked over endless miles of mountains, climbed over countless logs, plowed through snow and slush, and raked the valleys with our field glasses. But bears were as scarce as hen's teeth. We saw a few tracks, but nothing compared to those seen in other years. We began to have a sneaking idea that the bear had all been killed off. We knew they had been a pest to campers and were becoming a menace to human life. We suspected the park authorities of quiet extermination. Several of the rangers admitted that selective killing was carried out yearly to rid the preserve of the most dangerous individuals. Then the elk began to pour back into the park. Singly, in couples, and in droves they returned, lean and scraggly. A few began to drop their calves. Then we began to see bear sign. The grizzly follow the elk, and after they come out of hibernation and get their fill of green grass, they naturally take to elk calves. Occasionally they include the mother in the menu. We also began to follow the elk. We watched at a bait. We sat up nights and days at a time, seeing only a few unfavorable specimens, and these were wild and wary as deer. We found the mosquitoes were more deadly than the bear. We tracked big worthy old boys around in circles and had various frustrated encounters with she-bears and cubs. Upon one occasion we were tracking a prospective specimen through the woods, proceeding with great caution, when evidently the beast heard us. Suddenly he turned on his tracks and came on a dead run for us. I was in advance and instantly drew my bow, holding it for the right moment to shoot. The bear came directly in our front, not more than 20 yards away, and being startled by the sight of us, threw his locomotive mechanism into reverse and skidded towards us in a cloud of snow and forest leaves. In the fraction of a second I perceived that he was afraid and not a proper specimen for our use. I held my arrow and the bear with an indignant, disgusted look, made a precipitous retreat. It was an unexpected surprise on both sides. They say that the Indians avoided the Yellowstone region, thinking it a land of evil spirits. In our wanderings, however, we picked up on Steamboat Point a beautiful red-shirt arrowhead, undoubtedly shot by an Indian at elk years before Columbus burst in upon these good people. In Hayden Valley we found an obsidian spearhead, another sign that the Indians knew good hunting grounds. But no Indian was ever so anxious to meet grizzly as we were. We hunted continually, but found none that suited us. We had to have the best. Frost assured us that we had made a mistake in ever trying to get grizzlies in the park, and that in the time we spent there we could have secured all our required specimens in the game fields of Wyoming or Montana. A month passed. The bears were beginning to lose their winter coats. Our party began to disintegrate. My brother and the judge were compelled to return to Detroit. A week or so later, Ned Frost and the cook were scheduled to take out another party of hunters from Cody and prepared to leave us. Young and I were determined to stick it out until the last chance was exhausted. We just had to get those specimens. Before Frost left us, however, he packed us up to the head of Cascade Creek, with our bows and arrows, bedrolls, a tarpaulin, and a couple of boxes of provisions. We had received word from a ranger that a big old grizzly had been seen at Soda Butte, and we were prepared to go after him. At the last moment before departure, a second word came that probably the same bear had moved down to Tower Falls and was ranging between this point and the canyon, killing elk round Dunraven Pass. Young and I scouted over this area and found diggings and his tracks. A good-sized bear will leave a 9-inch track. This monster's was 11 inches long. We saw where he made his kills and used certain fixed trails going up and down the canyons. Frost gave us some parting advice and his blessings, consigned us to our fate, and went home. Left to ourselves, we two archers inspected our tackle and put everything in prime condition. Our bows had stood the many wettings well, and we oiled them again. New strings were put on and thoroughly waxed. Our arrows were straightened, their feathers dried and preened in the sun. The broadheads were set on straight and sharpened to the last degree, and so prepared we determined to do our utmost. We were ready for the big fellow. In our reconnaissance we found that he was a real killer. His trail was marked by many bloody episodes. It seemed quite probable that he was the bear that 2 years before burst in upon a party of surveyors in the mountains and kept them treed all night. It is not unlikely that he was the same bear that caused the death of Jack Walsh. He seemed too expert in planning murder. We saw by his tracks how he lay in ambush watching a herd of elk, how he sneaked up on a mother elk and her recently born calf on the outskirt of the band, and with a great leap threw himself upon the two and killed them. In several places we saw the skins of these little wapiti licked clean and empty of bodily structure. No other male grizzly was permitted to enter his domain. He was, in fact, the monarch of the mountain, the great bear of Dunraven Pass. We pitched our little tent in a secluded wood some 3 miles from the lake at the head of Cascade Creek, and began to lay our plan of attack. We were by this time inured to fatigue and disappointment. Weariness and a loss of sleep had produced a dogged determination that knew no relaxation, and yet we were cheerful. Young has a fine quality so essential to a hunting companion, imperturbable good nature, never complaining, no matter how heavy the load, how long the trail, how late or how early the hour, how cold, how hot, how little or how poor the food. We were there to win, and nothing else mattered. If it rained and we must wait, we took out our musical instruments, built up the fire, and soothed our troubled souls with harmony. This is better than tobacco or whiskey for the purpose. In fact, Young is so abstemious that even tea or coffee seem a bit intemperate to him and are only to be used under great physical strain. And as for profanity, why, I had to do all the swearing for the two of us. We were trained down to rawhide and sinew, keyed to alertness, and ready for any emergency. Often in our wanderings at night, we ran unexpectedly into wild beasts in the dark. Some of these were bears. Our pocket flashlights were used as defensive weapons. A snort, a crashing retreat through the brush, told us that our visitant had departed in haste, unable to stand the glaring light of modern science. We soon found that our big fellow was a night rover also, and visited his various kills under the cloak of darkness. In one particularly steep and rugged canyon, he crossed a little creek at a set place. Up on the side of this canyon, he mounted to the plateau above by one of 3 possible trails. At the top, within 40 yards of one of these, was a small promontory of rock, which we decided to form a blind and await his coming. We fashioned a shelter of young jack pines, constructed like a miniature corral, less than 3 by 6 feet in area, but very natural in appearance. Between us and the trail was a quantity of downed timber, which we hoped would act as an impediment to an onrushing bear, and the perpendicular face of our outcropping elevated us some 12 or 13 feet above the steep hillside. A small tree stood near our position and offered a possibility in case of attack, but we had long ago decided that no man can clamber up a tree in time to escape a grizzly charging at a distance less than 50 yards. We could be approached from the rear, but altogether it was an ideal ambush. The wind blew steadily up the canyon all night long and carried our scent away from the trail. Above us on the plateau was a recently killed elk, which acted as a perpetual invitation to bears and other prowlers of the night. So we started watching in this blind, coming soon after dark and remaining until sunrise. The nights were cold, the ground pitiless, and the moon, nearly its full, crept low through a maze of mist. Dressed in our warmest clothing and permitting ourselves one blanket and a small piece of canvas, we huddled together in a cramped posture and kept vigil through the long hours. Neither of us smoked anyway, and of course this was absolutely taboo. We hardly whispered and even shifted our positions with utmost caution. Before us lay our bows ready strung and arrows, both in the quiver belted upright to the screen and standing free close at hand. The first evening we saw an old she-bear and her 2-year-old cubs coming up the path. They passed us with that soft, shuffling gait so uncanny to hear in the dark. We were delighted that they showed no sign of having detected us. But they were not suited to our purposes, and we let them go. The female was homely, fretful, and nervous. The cubs were yellow and ungainly. We looked for better things. Bears have personality as obvious as humans. Some are lazy, some alert, surly, or timid. Nearly all the females we saw showed that irritability and irascible disposition that go with the cares of maternity. This family was decidedly commonplace. They disappeared in the gloom, and we waited and waited for the big fellow that sometime must appear. But morning came first. We stole from our blind, chilled and stiffened, and wandered back to camp to breakfast and sleep. The former was a fairly successful event, but the latter was made almost impossible by the swarms of mosquitoes that beset us. A smudge fire and canvas head coverings gave us only a partial immunity. By sundown we were on our way again to the blind, but another cold, dreary night passed without adventure. On our way to camp in the dim light of early dawn, a land fog hung low in the valley. As we came up a rough path, there suddenly appeared out of the obscurity 3 little bear cubs, not 35 yards away. They winded us, squeaked, and stood on their hind legs, peering in our direction. We dropped like stones in our tracks, scarcely breathing, figuratively frozen to the ground, for instantly the fiercest-looking grizzly we ever saw bounded over the cubs and straddled them between her forelegs. Nothing could stop her if she came on. A little brush intervened, and she could not locate us plainly, for we could see her eyes wandering in search of us. But her trembling muscles, the vicious clamping of her jaws, and the guttural growls all spoke of immediate attack. We were petrified. She wavered in her intent, turned, cuffed her cubs down the hill, snorted, and finally departed with her family. We heaved a deep sigh of relief, but she was wonderful. She was the most beautiful bear we had seen, large, well-proportioned, with dark brown hair, having just a touch of silver. She was a patrician, the aristocrat of the species. We marked her well. Next day, just at sunset, we got our first view of the Great Bear of Dunraven Pass. He was coming down a distant canyon trail. He looked like a giant in the twilight. With long, swinging strides, he threw himself impetuously down the mountainside. Great power was in every movement. He was magnificent. He seemed as large as a horse, and had that great supple strength given to no other predatory animal. Though we were used to bears, a strange misgiving came over me. We proposed to slay this monster with a bow and arrow. It seemed preposterous. In the blind, another long, cold night passed. The moon drifted slowly across the heavens and sank in a haze of clouds at daybreak. Just at the hush of dawn, the homely female and her tow-headed progeny came shuffling by. We were desperate for specimens, and one of these would match that which we already had. I drew up my bow and let fly a broadhead at one of the cubs. It struck him in the ribs. Precipitately, the whole band took flight. My quarry fell against an obstructing log and died. His mother stopped, came back several times, gazed at him pensively, then disappeared. We got out, carried him to a distant spot, and skinned him. He weighed 125 pounds. My arrow had shaved a piece of his heart. Death was instantaneous. We packed home the hindquarters and made fine grizzly stew. Before this we had found that old bears were tough and rancid, but the little ones were sweet and tender as suckling pigs. The stew was particularly good, well seasoned with canned tomatoes and the last of our potatoes and onions. Sad to relate, the better part of this savory pot next day was eaten by a wandering vagabond of the Ursus family. Not content with our stew, he devoured all our sugar, bacon, and other foodstuffs not in cans, and wound up his debauch by wiping his feet on our beds and generally messing up the camp. Probably he was a regular camp thief. That night, early in the watch, we heard the worthy old boy coming down the canyon, hot in pursuit of a large brown bear. As he ran, the great animal made quite a noise. His claws clattered on the rocks, and the ground seemed to shake beneath us. We shifted our bows ready for action, and felt the keen edge of our arrows. Way off in the forest, we heard him tree the cowardly intruder with such growls and ripping of bark that one would imagine he was about to tear the tree down. After a long time he desisted, and grunting and wheezing, came slowly up the canyon. With the night glasses we could see him. He seemed to be considerably heated with his exercise, and scratched himself against a young fir tree. As he stood on his hind legs, with his back to the trunk, and rubbed himself to and fro, the tree swayed like a reed, and as he lifted his nose, I observed that it just touched one of the lower branches. In the morning, after he had gone, and we were on our way to camp, we had passed this very fir, and stretching up on my tiptoes, I could just touch the limb with my fingers. Having been a pole vaulter in my youth, I knew by experience that this measurement was over 7 feet 6 inches. He was a real he-bear. We wanted him more than ever. The following day it rained. In fact, it rained nearly every day near the end of our stay. But this was a drenching that stopped at sunset, leaving all the world sweet and fragrant. The moon came out full and beautiful. Everything seemed propitious. We went to the blind about an hour before midnight, feeling that surely this evening the big fellow would come. After 2 hours of frigidity and mobility, we heard the velvety footfalls of bear coming up the canyon. There came our patrician and her royal family. The little fellows pattered up the trail before their mother. They came within range. I signaled Young, and we shot together at the cubs. We struck. There was a squeak, a roar, and a jumble of shadowy figures, and the entire flock of bears came tumbling in our direction. At that very moment, the big grizzly appeared on the scene. There were 5 bears in sight. Turning her head from side to side, trying to find her enemy, the she-bear came towards us. I whispered to Young, "Shoot the big fellow." At the same time, I drew an arrow to the head and drove it at the oncoming female. It struck her full in the chest. She reared, threw herself sideways, and bellowed with rage, staggered, and fell to the ground. She rose again, weakened, stumbled forward, and with great gasp she died. In less than a half a minute it was over. The little ones ran up the hill past us. One later returned and sat at its mother's head, then disappeared in the dark forever. While all this transpired, the monster grizzly was romping back and forth in the shaded forest, not more than 65 yards away. With deep booming growls like distant thunder, he voiced his anger and intent to kill. As he flitted between the shadows of the trees, the moonlight glinted on his massive body. He was enormous. Young discharged 3 arrows at him. I shot 2. We should have landed, he was so large, but he galloped off, and I saw my last arrow at the point-blank range of 75 yards fall between his legs. He was gone. We thought we had missed the beast, and grief descended heavily upon us. The thought of all the weary days and nights of hunting and waiting, and now to have lost him, was very painful. After our palpitating hearts were quiet and the world seemed peaceful, we got out of our blind and skinned the female by flashlight. She was a magnificent specimen, just right in color and size for the museum, not fat, but weighing a trifle over 500 pounds. My arrow had severed a rib and buried its head in her heart. We measured her and saved her skull and long bones for the taxidermist. At daybreak we searched for the cubs and found one dead under a log with an arrow through his brains. The others had disappeared. We had no idea that we hit the great bear, but just to gather up our shafts, we went over the ground where he had been. One of Young's arrows was missing. That gave us a thrill. Perhaps we had hit him after all. We went further in the direction he had gone. There was a trace of blood. We trailed him. We knew it was dangerous business. Through clumps of jack pines we cautiously followed, peering under every pile of brush and fallen tree. Deep into the forest we tracked him, where his bloody smear was left upon fallen logs. Soon we found where he had rested. Then we discovered the forepart of Young's arrow. It had gone through him. There was a pool of blood. Then we found the feathered butt, which he had drawn out with his teeth. 4 times he wallowed down in the mud or soft earth to rest and cool his wound. Then, beneath a great fir, he had made a bed in the soft loam and left it. Past this we could not track him. We hunted high and low, but no trace of him could we find. Apparently he had ceased bleeding, and his footprints were not recorded on the stony ground about. We made wide circles, hoping to pick up his trail. We searched up and down the creek. We cross-cut every forest path and runway, but no vestige remained. He was gone. We even looked up in the tree and down in the ground where he had wallowed. For 5 hours we searched in vain, and at last, worn with disappointment and fatigue, we lay down and slept on the very spot where he had last stopped. Near sundown we awoke, ate a little food, and started all over again to find the great bear. We retraced our steps and followed the great fading evidence till it brought us again to the pit beneath the fir tree. He must be near. It was absolutely impossible for any animal to have lost so much blood and travel more than a few hundred yards past this spot. We had explored the creek bottom and the cliffs above from below, and we now determined to traverse every foot of the rim of the canyon from above. As we climbed over the face of the rock, we saw a clot of dried blood. We let ourselves down the sheer descent, came upon a narrow little ledge, and there below us lay the huge monster on his back, against a boulder, cold and stiff. As dead as Caesar, our hearts nearly burst with happiness. There lay the largest grizzly bear in Wyoming, dead at our feet. His rugged coat was matted with blood. Well back in his chest, the arrow wound showed clear. I measured him. 26 inches of bear had been pierced through and through. 1 arrow killed him. He was tremendous. His great wide head, his worn, glistening teeth, his massive arms, his vast, ponderous feet, and long, curved claws, all were there. He was a wonderful beast. It seemed incredible. I thumped Young on the shoulder. My, that was a marvelous shot. We started to skin our quarry. It was a stupendous job, as he weighed nearly 1,000 pounds and lay on the steep canyon side, ready to roll on and crush us. But with ropes, we lashed him by the neck to a tree and split him up the back, later box-skinning the legs according to the method required by the museum. By flashlight, acetylene lamp, candlelight, firelight, moonlight, we labored. We used up all our knives, having neglected to bring our whetstones, sharpened our blades on the volcanic boulders about us. By assiduous industry for 9 straight hours, we finished him after a fashion. His skin was thick and like scar tissue. His meat was all tendons and gristle. The hide was tight, as if glued on. In the middle of the night, we stopped long enough to broil some grizzly cub steaks and brew a pot of tea, and then we went at it again. As we dismembered him, we weighed the parts. The veins were absolutely dry of blood and without substance, which represents a loss of nearly 10% of his weight. He was 916 pounds. There was hardly an inch of fat on his back. At the end of autumn, this adipose layer would be nearly 6 inches thick. He would then have weighed over 1,400 pounds. He stood nearly 4 feet high at the shoulders, while his skull measured 18.5 inches long. His entire body length was 7 feet 4 inches. As we cleaned his bones, we hurled the great slabs of muscle down the canyon, knowing from experience that this would be a sign for other bears to leave the vicinity. Only the wolves and jays will eat grizzly meat. At last we finished him, as the sun rose over the mountain ridges and gilded all the canyon with glory. We cleaned and salted the pelts, packed them on our backs, and dripping with salt brine and bear grease, staggered to the nearest wagon trail. The hide of the big bear, with unskinned paws and skull, weighed nearly 150 pounds. We cached our trophies, tramped the weary miles back to camp, cleaned up, packed, and wandered to the nearest station, from which we ordered a machine. When this arrived, we gathered our belongings, turned our various specimens over to a park ranger to be given the final treatments, and started on our homeward trip. We were so exhausted from loss of sleep, exertion, and excitement that we sank into a stupor that lasted almost the entire way home. The California Academy of Sciences now has a handsome representative group of Ursus horribilis imperator. We have the extremely satisfactory feeling that we killed 5 of the finest grizzly bears in Wyoming. The sport was fair and clean, and we did it all with the bow and arrow.